tuning in. We are together today, and just a reminder that after this share, we will have a break for about a month. We'll be away, and some of us are already away, tuning in. David from Bangkok, and so we'll be away, and hopefully we'll resume back near the beginning of July after today, but we'll send a note to everybody just to keep you updated. Okay, so this week's Parsha, Parshat Korach, and as I mentioned to David, I'll be hearing this twice because in Chutz La'aretz they're 1 week behind Israel, and then only catching up with their double portion of Chukat Balak. Well, we'll just read one of them. In any case, Parshat Korach, a fascinating parsha. It's unfortunately bringing to a head the whole revolution against Moshe Rabbeinu. And here is a man who gave his everything for the cause, and yet, unfortunately, he sees all of these malcontents, not only in this week's parsha, but in numerous parshiot. It's very reminiscent of what has happened to most of Israel's leaders, unfortunately. They do not just go quietly into that good night, as the poet said. No, they generally have very inauspicious endings. We saw this with Golda Meir, we saw this with Menachem Begin, we saw it with Ariel Sharon, obviously with the assassination of Rabin. It just seems to be almost par for the course that the leaders of Israel, they don't just simply fade away. And maybe Moshe Rabbeinu is the example for that because he too, unfortunately, has a very, very depressing ending where he pleads with God. He wants to continue on into the land. That was his greatest dream. He says to Hashem, you can make me into a bird, I'll fly in, I don't have to be the leader, etc. But unfortunately, Hashem decrees otherwise. In any case, one of the main, you might say, the greatest thorn in the side of Moshe Rabbeinu is his own cousin Korach, who launches this rebellion against Moshe and against the leadership of Moshe and Aaron, and kind of really um, out of what we would normally expect from Moshe Rabbeinu, who was so humble. He's going to react very, very forcefully, even violently, and ask Hashem to create some unusual event that will not only dispose of Korach and his team, but also do it in a way that people will remember it forever. Not like Moshe Rabbeinu at all. But by this time, after having been through the incidences of the golden calf and the spies and the complainers, the mitonanim, who we talked about, complain for complaint's sake, not for any real cause. He's had it, and therefore he lashes out at Korach. And the story of Korach, it's what we call today a cautionary tale, somebody who has it all. The Medrash says that he was one of the two richest people who ever lived. The other one, by the way, being Haman. He had these vast, of course, it's all relative to the time, but he had vast wealth. He had a very prominent position. He was a Levi. He and his family carried the Aron Kodesh. And of course, he had an in with the powers that be. But that was not enough for him. He wanted to bring the whole system down. He questions God's choice of Aaron as Kohen Gadol for life. Well, why does he have to serve for life? Can't he have, retire at some point? He attacks Moshe Rabbeinu. He mocks Moshe Rabbeinu. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. He wants more power, So he has the riches, he has the pedigree, he wants power, and he goes after Moshe in a big way. Now, uh, he asks some of these questions, which trying to trap Moshe. If you have a room filled with Sifrei Kodesh, does it need a mezuzah? And does a garment that's completely made of tchelet purple, does it need another string of purple on the tzitzit? We'll come back to that in a moment. But first, I want to talk a little bit about, and I think we may have discussed this earlier, but I find it so fascinating that in his band of rebels, he has Datan and Aviram. We know them; they're long-standing critics and pains in the back, let's call it, of Moshe Rabbeinu. But also this almost unknown individual named On, in English OHN. It's a short name. And On is listed as one of the conspirators against Moshe at the beginning of the revolt, at the beginning of the Parsha. But by the time we get to the end of the story, where the earth opens up and devours these rebels, On is nowhere to be found or mentioned. What happened to On? So the Medrash tells a very fascinating story that On's wife, and she doesn't really, she's not named. We don't know what her name was, but as I say, she's definitely in a league of her own. She's quite brilliant. She says to On, "You're a shmendrik. You don't know what you're in for." She said, "We know what Korach's all about. First of all, he may very well lose, in which case you'll go down with him. But even if Korach wins, he is not the type of person who's going to share the wealth and share the power. You'll still be basically a nobody, even if On succeeds in this rebellion." And by the way, this idea is what's echoed in the Pirkei Avot, in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot that says when we talk about doing something l'shem shamayim for a higher purpose. So what does Pirkei Avot say? An example of an argument that is l'shem shamayim is the arguments between Hillel and Shammai. They're both trying to arrive at the truth. They're God-fearing. They want the same thing in a sense. They just want to interpret the halacha properly. And so they continually give diverse opinions, but that's okay. That's for a good reason, l'shem shamayim. But who is not l'shem shamayim, says Pirkei Avot? Korach v'kol adato. Korach and his gang, his group. Now, this is a little bit hard to understand. It probably should have said who's not arguing l'shem shamayim. It should have said Korach and Moshe. It doesn't say that. It says Korach va'adato to kind of indicate to us that they weren't really after the truth and after some noble cause. They would have broken down and fought among themselves. They didn't have any uh, as I say, high-minded purpose for that argument, and therefore, from the very beginning, On's wife sees, no, this is not a good place to be. So she says to him, "You're not going to the rebellion. You're staying home." And we can just picture the scene. Some people want to say that, you know, similar to what Yehudit did, uh, to give some wine and cheese, and he falls asleep, and she makes sure that he doesn't go. Meanwhile, Korach is looking for On. He goes, says the Medrash, searching, "Where's my co-conspirator? I need him." And he goes to On's house. And as he approaches On's home or tent, On's wife comes out, and her head is not covered. She's not wearing whatever head covering was proper at the time. And so Korach stops dead in his tracks because he can't approach. So he can't actually enter the house or the tent to find On. He just yells out to the wife, "Where's On?" And she says, "Take your rebellion elsewhere. On's not coming today. He's not coming out to play. Go, go on your way." And because he can't approach there, because he can't come any nearer to a woman whose hair is uncovered, he leaves. And On, again, is saved by that. But what you're left with in the story, at least what I'm left with, is this crazy realization that what's going on here, that here is a man who is prepared to bring down the whole system, to intimidate and dethrone, so to speak, Moshe Rabbeinu and our own Kohen Gadol, and essentially defy God's appointment of them. And yet he's so brazen in that respect, and yet he comes off as being so frum that he won't go anywhere near this woman without her head covering. Something does not make sense here. And therefore, I want to say that this represents a syndrome that we see continually in many different examples, and I'll give some, of those who don't see the big picture, that in a limited way, in a tiny way, they may want to observe the halacha while ignoring the greater issue here, and that is following God. And it makes no sense, but we see it all the time. Some people would call this fake frumkeit, but I would say that it's also a syndrome that goes on all the time where we don't see the forest for the trees. Now, I mentioned before that Korach asks, these halachic questions to Moshe Rabbeinu, trying to make it seem as how silly it is that a room filled with Sifrei Torah needs to have a mezuzah, but the halacha often stands on its own merit. We see this reflected sometimes where something doesn't make complete sense to us. But if the pasuk says to do it, you have to do it. One example is that if somebody borrows a tool or a plow or something from another person to plow his field, if it breaks down, he has to pay for it. But if the owner is with him and it breaks down, he doesn't have to pay. And the rabbis asked the question, what's the difference? He's using it, it broke down, he should pay for it. No, the pasuk says he doesn't have to. It's what we call gezeret hakatuv. It's the decree of the pasuk. And well, you can question it, but it is what it is. In kind of scientific terms, I like to refer to the story of Aristotle, who had a theory of gravity where he said that different objects, let's say thrown off a building, will fall at different speeds depending on their weight. Something heavy will fall faster than something light. Then comes along two nice young men, Galileo and Newton, and they prove, no, Aristotle, sorry, you were wrong. They will fall at exactly the same rate. Does it make sense? Doesn't it seem illogical that something heavier should fall faster? No, that's science. And sometimes science, like halacha, stands on its own merits. So therefore, Moshe had to say to Korach, even if the room is filled with Sifrei Torah, it still needs a mezuzah with that small parchment of the Shema. And if a garment is all tchelet colored, still needs a strand, a thread of tchelet along with it, because the halacha can be the halacha. But at the same time, having said that, it's still important to note that we need to also be able to see the bigger picture, because at the end of the day, we worship Hashem and not the halacha. And when there is ever a dispute between those two, we would err, and we would really be foolish to follow the halacha instead of following Hashem. And I will give just a few examples. although there are many, but kind of all stemming from this whole issue of not seeing the bigger picture, of Korach being afraid to come close to a woman whose hair is uncovered, yet he's perfectly willing to defy Hashem and everything Hashem has said. Um, some of my favorite stories, and some of these I have told before, but I'll repeat them again. There's a story of two Kohanim. You know, the Kohanim rarely, maybe only once during their life, different Kohanim would bring the Ketoret, the incense offering, which was said to include immense wealth when you brought that karban, that offering. So the Gemara talks about two Kohanim who are vying to bring that karban, and they're racing up the ramp where the incense is to be able to do the offering, and one of them is so determined to get to the top and to beat the other Kohen, he takes a knife and he stabs the other Kohen, says the Gemara, and he falls bleeding on the floor. And the Kohen Gadol sees this happening, and he's completely shocked by what he sees, and he looks at this Kohen who did the stabbing, and the Kohen says, "Don't worry, I took the knife out before he died, so the knife did not become tamei, which happens to a dead body." Kohen looks at him like, are you crazy? That's what you're worried about? You killed somebody, and you're worried about making the knife tamei? I love the story that Rabbi Leff tells, and I think I've told this before. It's a great one. When he was rabbi in Miami Beach, and a woman came and said to him, "You have to help me, Rabbi. My husband refuses to eat on Yom Kippur, even though the doctor said you must eat, because otherwise you'll be very dangerous for your health. Certain amount you have to eat." But he says no, he won't listen. So Rabbi Leff says, "Bring him to me." So he comes to Rav Leff's office, and he goes through the story, and the man says, "Listen, Rabbi, I'm much older than you." He was a young man then, Rav Leff. "I've been around a lot longer than you, and I fast every year, and I will continue to fast. That's what I do. And you're not going to convince me otherwise." So Rav Leff says to him, um, "Okay, I see I can't convince you, so you're going to do what you do. But I am telling you that if you do not fast, and if you do fast on this Yom Kippur, then I'm going to inform the Gabayim of the Shul. You will not be entitled to any kibudim. You will not get an aliyah to the Torah. You will not be allowed to daven for the Amud, even on the Yortzeit in your family." So the man says, "What are you kidding me? Because I want to fast on Yom Kippur like the Torah says? You're punishing me?" So Rabbi Lev said to him, "Listen, we don't have a monitor when people come into shul to see who's religious and who isn't. You walk in that door, you're like anybody else. But there is an exception. We do not give any honors to someone who is an idolater." And the man says, "I'm an idol worshiper?" So Rabbi Lev says, "Listen, I know that our Torah and Hashem says that if you're in danger and it's life threatening, you have to eat on Yom Kippur. If you insist on fasting, you're not following Judaism, you must be following some other religion, in which case you really, people of other religions, we don't give honors to." And the man ultimately relented. But of course, the message is clear. There is a bigger picture. And at the end of the day, there may be halacha, but Hashem, you have to consider, what does Hashem want me to do? And what would be the proper response in an extenuating circumstance? You know, they tell the story of the the yeshiva student who's lives in the dormitory at the yeshiva, and they have kind of a communal kitchen with a refrigerator, and he likes in the morning to have a bowl of cereal. So he keeps the cereal in his room, but he doesn't have a fridge in his room. So he puts the milk in this common room, common kitchen, this container of milk. And he comes back the next day and the milk is gone. Somebody has used the milk. Well, okay, he's not happy about that. He goes out and he buys another small container of milk. He puts it in the fridge. And sure enough, comes back again. Somebody else used it, took his milk. So the third time, he puts a sign on it and says, "This milk belongs to me. Do not touch it. You have bli reshut. You can't take it. It's mine. Leave it alone. If you take it, you're stealing it." He says, "That'll do it." But same as before, comes back the next day, the milk is gone. Finally, he thinks, and he comes up with the solution. And he puts another sign on the milk. And sure enough, the next day, the milk is there. What does the sign say? It's a big sign that's written on it. Be aware, this milk is not Chalav Yisrael. So if you understand the story, here is somebody, he doesn't mind if he steals it, but he will not have Chalav Akum. He will have to have Chalav Yisrael. And I remember that uh, when I was leading a cruise on a big ship. Now we do, thank God, we have uh, control of the whole ship. But when we'd have 50, 100 people out of 2,000 on one of these cruises, a man comes to me and he says, "Rabbi, I think I've read this correctly, but we'll be at sea. My wife needs the mikvah. I think, would it be okay if she uses the pool on the cruise ship?" And I look at him and I say, "Would you think this through for a moment? There's 2,000 people on the ship, and you want your wife to go into the pool as a mikvah? No." And we get into this syndrome that we don't see the bigger picture. Bernice is there. She was telling me is that sometimes the rabbi will say, it's okay to think about God when you're saying the Shemona Esrei. You can take a moment and think about God. You, as I say, it's the forest for the trees that we have to be able to consider and think, is this what Hashem would want us to do in these situations? And sometimes we have to do the bigger good, the greater good. Certainly, this, I imagine, was going through the head of Rabbi Yehuda Hanassi when he decided, I have to write down the oral law, because if I don't, even though the Torah, it's forbidden, the Halacha says you must transmit it orally, you cannot write it down, but he wrote it down. He understood that there was a greater need, and he said, okay, I'm doing it, and I hope that Hashem will prove me right, and history will prove me right, because if I don't, it'll be lost. And um, this is why we say, interestingly enough, when we talk about the reasons why the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, one of the reasons is that we did not say Birkat HaTorah. Every morning there's a bracha we say on the Torah. Hagomela, it's, without going into it, there's really two brachot that we say about learning Torah. And the Gemara says the people of the time, they didn't say the bracha, and everybody asks, well, so what? I mean, that caused the Beit HaMikdash to be destroyed, but they answer that the bracha focuses you on the bigger picture, on what you're doing, and it brings God into it by mentioning Hashem's name. And therefore, they were going through the motions, but they weren't doing it in a godly fashion. They weren't doing it with the right motivation. And Hashem sees through that. It's one of the reasons I mentioned before that Rav Aryeh Kaplan Zatzal told me that davens, when he davened, he passed away at a young age, but he told me whenever he davens, he doesn't face the Aron Kodesh directly. He turns away a bit because he doesn't want to think or have anyone else think that he's praying to the Torah. He says, I don't pray to the Torah. I love the Torah. I fulfill the words of the Torah, but I don't pray to the Torah. I pray to Hashem. And I want to make that clear that I'm praying to God. And there is a qualitative difference. Um, I'll end with so, as I say, these situations arise, and we have to understand that the halacha is sacrosanct. And even if we don't necessarily agree or understand it, normally speaking, we fulfill the halacha and we shouldn't dismiss it. Otherwise, we wouldn't be keeping kosher. We wouldn't be, wearing tzitzit or any of these things that are chukim. That's true. But you also have to ask yourself in every given situation, what would Hashem want me to do in this situation? So I feel finished with a very moving story that Rabbi Raphael Grossman, who was the rabbi of at one time, the largest Orthodox synagogue in America, in Memphis, Tennessee, of all places, not New York. And he told me the following story, that when he was a yeshiva student in New York, um, he was walking home with a group of other yeshiva students on a Shabbat morning after davening, and he came across an accident that occurred right in front of him, where a woman was hit by a car. So it was a black woman hit by a car and was lying on the ground by the street, bleeding profusely. And it was a very shocking scene, but without really thinking, he took off his talit and he wrapped it, he put it on top of this woman to cover this woman. Now, there was no Eruv there, at least in those days. And after the ambulance came, unfortunately, the woman did not survive. He told me this car crash. He was overcome with this sense of guilt because he said, I I took off my talit. I ran to where this woman is. I was carrying it on Shabbat. I then put it over, and basically it was covered with blood. And he felt, what did I do? I violated the Shabbat. And he said he ran to the home of his Rebbe. His Rebbe was the sainted Rav Yisrael Zeb Gustman. Some people may have heard of him. He was a very well-known, wonderful person who later would come to Yerushalayim. And he came and he said to him, Rebbe, I'm just filled with guilt. And he told him the story. And Rav Gustman said to him, and he told me this story, and I still really, when I say it, I just shake, and so did he when he told it to me, is that his Rebbe said to him, Raphael, in your life, I'm sure you're going to do wonderful things, and your talit is going to accompany you as you go through your career, and it envelops you. It's one of only three mitzvot that envelop a person in a mitzvah: the sukkah, Eretz Yisrael, and the talit. And he says, you're going to do great things wrapped in that talis. But I want to tell you right now, you'll never bring more kedusha, more holiness to that talit than you did at that moment when you covered that dying woman. It's a powerful story, and it tells us that we sometimes have to use our seichel, and we have to, again, fulfill the halacha as best as we possibly can. But at the same time, Hashem wants us to use the gifts He's given us of wisdom and of compassion, chesed, and take that all into account whenever we act. So, in this famous story with On, his wife deserves this great credit, but it also indicates to us, for anybody who wonders where was Korach coming from, he wasn't coming from a good place. He had arguments that sounded very, very logical and well-meaning, but at the end of the day, when you look at the bigger picture, you see what he was really all about. And that, I think, is a great lesson for us to see that bigger picture. And we live in a society where, unfortunately, we are surrounded too often by individuals who are proposing to be observant and lovers of Torah and lovers of God, but the way they're acting is clearly not something that Hashem approves of. And if they saw the bigger picture, they would back down and say, I'm not defending Torah, I'm demeaning Torah. And hopefully they will get that through their heads and their hearts, and they will change, and we'll have a much better society than we're experiencing in many places right now. I'm going to just say the prayer for our Chayalim Aktoshim. Mishaber Chapoteinu Avraham Yitzchak Yaakov Yivorech et Chayalei Tzva Hagana al Yisrael Hamdim al Mishmaratzenu Varei Eloheinu Migvul al Lebanon Vad Mibar Mitzrayim Min Hayam Hagadol Ad Lavo Ha'arava B'Yabasha Ba'Avir Ubayam Yitein Adonai Toivenu Akamim Aleinu Nigofim Lifnehem HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yishmor V'Yatzil et Chayaleinu Mikol Tzra V'Tzukah V'Mokol Negel Machala V'Yishlach Bracha V'Atzlacha B'Chol Ma'asei Dehem Yadber Sonenu Takteim V'Yatreim B'Chet Yeshua V'Ater Nitzachon V'Kuyam B'Hem HaKatuv K'Adonai Elohechem Holechim Lachem Lo Shi'atchem V'Nomar Amen. Everybody have a wonderful few weeks ahead. We'll be back in touch with you when we resume. Shabbat Shalom and stay safe. We are still on war footing. It may not seem like it, but let's take that into account and make sure we think about our safety and Hashem in all of our tefillot. Shabbat Shalom. Good to have everybody with you and with us here tonight, and we'll see you again soon.